Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're discussing how living with risk affects us. Does it enrich our lives or impoverish them? And what are the implications for public policy? Hello, my name is Alan Renwick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Through this podcast, we want to let you into some of our most intriguing research findings that we think the wider world needs to know about. And today, we're focusing on some work that is both fascinating and directly relevant to our current extraordinary times. We're looking at the impact of living with risk. Living, that is, with the possibility, but not the certainty, that something bad might happen to us. In these times of pandemic and economic recession, living with risk to our health, risk to our livelihoods, is part of many people's daily reality. Some political philosophers have suggested that a certain amount of exposure to risk is good for us. It enhances our self-respect and gives us a sense that the contribution we make to society actually matters. But recent work challenges that. It finds that if you're more likely to lose your job, you're less likely to feel good about yourself. It also suggests that different kinds of risk may affect us in different ways. And all of this has big implications for public policy and politics. How generous a social safety net should the state provide? And are politicians necessarily good at understanding the ways in which the wider population experiences risk? Well, that research is by my colleague Lucy Barnes, Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at UCL, working with Alice Badarin from the University of Reading. And Lucy joins me to discuss it. Welcome, Lucy, to UCL Uncovering Politics. Could I begin by asking you, why do some people argue that risk is good for us?
Yeah, so it's a good question, but I think it has a quite intuitive answer that, most of us can relate to, that we can think back to kind of small episodes in our life where we do actually experience a real kind of payoff, whether it's in this sense of agency or just feeling good about the kind of person that we are from exposing ourselves to risk and usually also overcoming them. And so part of what we're interested in is certainly focusing in on the experience of the risk before you know how it turned out. Because if it turns out badly, clearly that's going to be bad for your feelings of well-being. And if it turns out well, then arguably, then surely it would be good. But if you think about, from my life, for example, I've lived in 3 different countries, and you might think of that as taking a bit of a risk to up sticks and move to America where you don't know anyone, and then to succeed in that context is empowering, and it does make you feel good about yourselves. And so migration is one example that people have studied as this exposure to danger coupled with a confidence that you kind of can overcome the danger, and that sense of mastery when in fact you do so. And also in terms of risky sports activities, a lot of my friends are keen rock climbers, and that's, has that same vein. You know that there's a danger that something bad might happen, but you're quite confident that it won't happen to you because you're going to have those skills, have those capacities to overcome that. And I think in the context of distributive justice, as the philosophers would talk about it, it's quite linked to this idea, liberal philosophical idea, that people should have this sense of their self-worth and this confidence in their ability to realize the plans that they've set out for their lives. And this might be direct, because the risk that my goal might not be realized sharpens its value to me. I become more aware of it. It might be indirect, because in order to avoid the bad outcome, I do other good things. So I work very hard to avoid losing my job, and then it's not the risk per se, but through the risk motivates me to some valuable hard work, which gives me this sense of pride or this sense of worth. And then the third argument, which I think is it's the most social, if you will, is that by allowing others to be exposed to risk, or by exposing other people to risk, we demonstrate to them that we have that faith in their capacities, that we think they have the mastery to overcome this risk of failure in a certain situation. And those 3 kind of pathways, if you will, are, I think, the way that we might generalize a little bit from the narrow experiences of risk to this kind of broader idea that some risk might be beneficial for this sense of self-worth and self-respect.
Right, yes. So you're not just saying that risk is good when we go out onto the sports field and do something slightly risky, but the argument from some of these political philosophers, and you're particularly picking up on work by John Thomasy, the idea there is that being exposed to risk in the job market, so the possibility that you might lose your job and that there isn't all that much of a safety net for you if you do lose your job, that's actually kind of an empowering thing for you. You feel better about yourself. You kind of feel like you're making a valuable contribution to society, that if society said, yeah, it doesn't really matter whether you do your job well or not, you're still going to be just fine, then that would kind of suggest that your job doesn't actually matter. So it's kind of empowering to have that sense of jeopardy, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And the argument that we're trying to pick up on and investigate in this paper exactly comes from this book by John Tomasi called Free Market Fairness. And what he's trying to do there is really make an argument against some of the insurance functions of developed European welfare states. Not so much employment protection, which prevents you losing your job, but the kind of, if you were to lose your job, what unemployment insurance is available to you, how generous is that? And his argument there is that this kind of positive experience of risk, it's distinct from the argument that we shouldn't do this because we have values other than those that are central to this kind of liberal distributive justice. This idea of self-respect comes from Rawls, who advocates political rights should be centrally protected by any institutions, but that economic freedoms do not have that privileged position. And Tomasi wants to kind of say, oh, but they should. And the reason they should is actually starting from your own premises, that this kind of moral worth and self-respect is undermined by disallowing the experience of risk, which in his view is what these kind of institutions of the welfare state do.
So that's one kind of intuition pushing in one direction. You're suggesting that perhaps we have some intuitions pushing in the other direction as well. What would they be?
Well, one of them, and I think we'll come back to this later, is that the most compelling kind of enjoyable experiences of risk are quite different from this systematic economic type of risk or health type of risk that we kind of need to work for this to be an argument about social and economic institutions. So these feel-good risks, as I would call them, they tend to have specific characteristics. But when we think about the kind of the three general pathways, the direct, the indirect, and the social that I mentioned before, yes, we can tell this story whereby, the risk leads me to work hard and then I feel good about myself because working hard makes me feel good in the indirect one. But we could also say, well, no, like this exposure to risk does not lead me to work hard. I find it very demotivating that no matter how hard I work, there's still a potential bad outcome looming in the future. And it's very demotivating and alienating. And I feel disengaged from my work and then I don't work hard. And then I feel bad about myself for not working. And similarly, this kind of direct effect, it might not lead to a greater kind of clarity of the value of your goals so much as a sense of helplessness and despondency. And on the social side as well, one person's expression of confidence in your capacities could actually be felt by me as just a disregard for the outcomes that I'm subject to, and a kind of that it's not so much that you respect my capacities, it's that you don't care if the bad outcomes happen. And so I think for any of these three pathways, we can tell plausible stories one way or the other. And to me, this is where the distinction between how far we can get philosophically and when we need to kind of switch into empirical mode really kicks in, because to me, these are empirical questions rather than philosophical ones. What actually happens is something that we can jump out of our philosophical armchair and go and ask in the world.
Yes, so I was going to ask you about that because I think of you as very much a number-crunching political scientist, and here you are talking to me about John Rawls and political philosophy and all of these things. How did this happen?
There are two types of answers to that. One is intellectual and probably more interesting, and one is social and happenstance and probably more necessary. So Alice and I were both postdocs at Nuffield, and so we would have lunch and, we'd be talking about what we're working on, and that's really the kind of practical way in which this came about. Some of my previous work has been on views on redistribution and the welfare state and progressive taxation, and one of the things that drive those views is this kind of insurance role that Tomasi picks up. And so, it's kind of well known, if you will, that one of the things that leads people to demand more action from the state is the feeling that they're exposed to risk. So people who work in jobs that have higher rates of unemployment, and also people who have kind of more specific skill profiles, so that were their industry to struggle, they would find it more difficult to retrain or to get a job without retraining. They tend to demand that the state step in and provide more generous insurance. So then when I heard about this argument that risk might be good and people would get this sense of agency from lacking that insurance, this is kind of a little bit of an empirical paradox, because we're like, well, I'm not sure, that's not how we empiricists think risks work in the world. But we've never really taken this philosophical idea of self-respect as the outcome that we're interested in. We've always cared more about how it affects who people vote for or what their preferences over the welfare state are.
Great. So you have these various different arguments going on both sides, for and against a positive role for risk, and you want to test them out empirically. So how have you gone about doing that?
As a number crunching political scientist, we dive in with large scale survey data from England in the first instance, and from Britain. And so the outcome that we're interested in is a philosophical one in ways. And so it's not really something that most surveys ask much about. How would you rate your moral worth? How would you rate your capacity to pursue your life plans in this kind of liberal philosophical way?
But you found a survey that did.
It turns out that actually quite a lot of the things that we think come quite close to this expression of kind of liberal philosophical self-respect, and they're not perfect, so I don't want to overclaim here and irritate any philosophical listeners, but items in surveys that are really actually designed to track mental health outcomes contain a lot of this kind of philosophical self-respect content. So there are questions on kind of, are you feeling useful? Do you feel like you're dealing with problems well? Do you feel good about yourself, which is a little bit broad, but we think, certainly overlaps with this feeling of worth as a person. And the best place that we found, because of this overlap with some of this psychological kind of subject area, was actually the Health Survey for England, which is a really nice big sample and asks all of these questions about, they think they're about mental health, and we think that they're about self-respect. So we have that. And then at the same time, that same survey also needs to ask something that allows us to track how exposed to risk people are. And so there are a few different ways we might think about this. And one of them is just how much risk do you perceive in any given domain, this kind of subjective risk. And then we might think people get that wrong, people overestimate, underestimate in ways that are going to be systematically linked, not for kind of good reasons, but for nuisance reasons with these kind of self-respect elements. So we also think about whether we can find objective characteristics that track people's exposure to risk. And so in the paper, we look at subjective probability of job loss. But then we also have information on the specific occupations that people work in. And from macro level data, objective, labor force statistics, we can calculate for people, and we actually do it by gender and occupation. So for women working in managerial roles, what percentage of people who identify as that's their occupation in their current or their previous job, what's the unemployment rate within that occupation gender group? And obviously some of those occupations have much higher unemployment rates than others, and we see that as kind of the objective risk of job loss that people face.
Okay, so you've got your subjective and objective measures of risk in terms of job insecurity, and you've got various different measures of self-respect. So what do you find?
Essentially, that whichever way we cut it in terms of subjective or objective measures, the story that risk looks good for people is not reflected in our data. Rather, the more risk people are exposed to in this specific form of the risk of losing your job, the lower the levels of self-respect people report.
Right. So it's a really kind of striking finding, actually. You've got this big debate that's been going on in the literature, and essentially you can resolve that debate with the evidence that you have here. Is that fair?
I think we can resolve it in a narrow way. We do find, and this is also consistent with other work on the impact of labour market insecurity and economic insecurity more broadly, that kind of risk really doesn't look good for people. We don't test the more general idea that any kind of risk is always going to be detrimental. So I wouldn't want to say, we've settled it, risk is bad, off we go. But I think the type of risk that we're talking about here, unemployment risk, which importantly is the type of risk which underpins social insurance and welfare state schemes. So this kind of question of distributive justice is implicated in this kind of risk. In this domain, we don't find any evidence really that it's positive, and we find consistent evidence that it's negative.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get on to different types of risk, just let's explore this kind of core finding a little bit further first. So what you've got here is essentially a correlation or a negative correlation that more exposure to risk produces less self-respect, or it's associated with less self-respect. As every self-respecting social scientist knows, correlation does not prove causation. And I guess we could think that, well, if you have low self-respect, then maybe that makes it more likely that you could lose your job, something like that. So can we be confident that the direction of causation is as you suggest it is?
Yeah, so thinking through this, we do have to be very careful. Like, we are relying on this kind of a correlational evidence base. And so it really is kind of incumbent on us to think through all the ways in which this might be working, not as exposure to risk driving these lower levels of self-respect, but actually all kinds of other relationships. And there are two that are particularly important to think about. One is something else is going on, which drives both higher levels of risk and lower levels of self-respect. Or the version that I think you mentioned is, actually it's backwards. And what happens is, first of all, you have low levels of self-respect, and then in a consequence, you're exposed to higher levels of risk. And so we try to address that in a few different ways by looking at different types of evidence. First of all, we are able to statistically control for a lot of the kind of typical correlates of not feeling good about yourself, although there isn't a vast body of literature, as I said, out there on self-respect in itself. But if we think that goes the same way as other similar things, then we kind of know how to address that a little bit with control variables. A really important concern is that both high risk and low self-respect are simply associated with more generalized disadvantage, that you have a less good job that's both more risky, and that it's actually this general disadvantage that makes you feel less good about yourself, and it's nothing really about the risk. And so I mentioned earlier about the thread of work in welfare state preferences literature that draws on the specificity of skills as an indicator of risk. And this is a particular type of risk, but it's the difference, if you can think about it, between someone who has, very transferable skills, so that their attachment to their current job isn't particularly important in terms of their ability to produce at a high level and to earn a good salary. So that if they were to lose their job, then they would be readily re-employed in a different industry, in a different firm, in a different sector, compared to people who have skills that are much more tied to either the firm that they work in, the company that they work in, or the sector that they work in. And so the useful thing for us here is that skill specificity is not particularly associated with disadvantage, right? There's the jobs that have the most highly specific skills are kind of clustered in the middle of the income distribution, or they are skilled. They typically tend to be quite stable. They tend to be good jobs, and the people who have them are not necessarily exposed to risk because they're just exposed to all kinds of bad things. They're exposed to risk because of this particular feature of their skills. And so when we use that instead of the unemployment risk as our indicator of risk, the results they are a little bit weaker, but we still find this same negative association. And so that's one of the key things that makes us think there's something about the risk itself, and it's not just the general disadvantage question. And then we have second data set that we jump into, because that one of the kind of key things that we're saying, correlation is not causation. It's just Well, these are just different types of people in fundamental ways that are unobservable. Even the skill specificity thing, the kind of person who gets these specific skills is different. Maybe they have a higher tolerance for risk, or they have a different attitude towards risk, and so on. So the other data set that we use is a panel where we can actually see the same people over time. This is the British Household Panel Survey. And with that survey, what we can do, again, it's still only correlation. There's no silver bullet here. But we can say that the correlation there is within the same individual. In those periods that they are experiencing higher levels of risk, they also report lower levels of self-respect. And the measures for self-respect in that survey are not quite as good. So that's why we don't kind of think of this as the main headline. But it turns out that same association comes out within people as well as across people.
Yeah, sounds pretty powerful. And you can use that data set as well to explore one of the other ideas that you mentioned earlier, that maybe while you're going through a period of risk, then that may be bad for your self-respect. But if you get through it and you kind of succeed and you feel that you've achieved something, then by overcoming adversity, that might lead to a positive sense of empowerment and that kind of thing. So you're able to look at that idea there as well, aren't you?
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think that's an important argument. It takes us a little bit away from this idea that risk in itself is good, or the experience of risk, which is kind of where we started. But without risk, perhaps you can't have this experience of, ex post having overcome it and therefore felt better about yourself. But actually, and again, this is in line with some of the work in economics, so the kind of economics of well-being. We find the patterns that we see are much more consistent with the story that when bad things do happen, when you go through a period of high risk, even when it's subsequently resolved, it has a negative effect on that level of self-respect that you report, rather than it's bad at the time, but you bounce back to an even higher level via this kind of resilience mechanism, having overcome adversity. We don't find evidence that that's going on.
Yeah, it all sounds like a bit of a slam dunk, to be honest. It sounds great to me. I mean, it's just such a clear set of results. It's such a nice example of how when we're doing this kind of research, we really try to squeeze the evidence that we've got and look at different types of evidence, different sources of evidence, and check things and recheck things and consider, but maybe it could be this. And you've just gone through a whole series of different bits of evidence, and they all come back giving you essentially the same conclusion. It's great.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there is the one little bright spark of hope for the people who want to make the argument that risk isn't that bad after all, is that when we look at the probabilities, the subjective probabilities of risk and how they affect self-respect, and if we kind of separate them out into different increments, most people actually report quite low levels of subjective risk of losing their job. And for those people, the move from no risk at all to a little bit of risk doesn't have an adverse effect. It doesn't help. Like, we don't ever recover a positive effect. But, where most people are, a tiny little bit more risk doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. But it's at the higher levels of risk that we really see the negative effect coming out. So, if you wanted to, like you say, squeeze the data to make it slightly more complicated, you could, but I don't think you're going to overturn the baseline result.
Yeah, and that begins to get us onto a theme that we have mentioned several times, namely different kinds of risk. And some kinds of risk might be less problematic for us and more positive perhaps for us than other kinds of risk. So you talk about whether we take risk on voluntarily or whether they're kind of imposed upon us involuntarily. You look at whether risk is something that affects our daily lives just all of the time, or whether, like going onto the sports field or climbing a mountain or something like that, it's something that happens for a short period of time and then we're out of that context again. And you also talk about the degree to which we can control the risks that we're subject to. And I thought it was really interesting. You kind of suggest that these different kinds of risk are likely to make a difference to their impact on our self-respect.
Yeah, and I mean, it should be very clear here that this is not where we have adequately detailed large sample survey data to probe this empirically in the same way that we did the main relationship. But this is how we have been thinking through kind of reconciling the result that we do find with this intuition, which we don't think is completely misguided, and which other kind of empirical work, more qualitative empirical work, typically going out and talking to people who live very risky lifestyles, and how we might reconcile those two, the two countervailing sides of the story, if you will. And I think it's important to us when thinking about this kind of relationship with self-respect that all of those intuitive arguments that I gave you at the beginning about the demonstration of mastery over danger that might lead to this kind of positive impact of risk, that impression comes from contexts where risks are voluntarily assumed, where they are typically somewhat controllable, right? People who like taking risks don't really like pure risks. Like going and playing roulette is not a kind of appealing risk for these kind of people who seek out risk, because it is entirely uncontrolled, compared to something like going out and playing poker, where there's an element of risk against you, but there's also the element of controllability. There's the element of mastery on the side of that. So that's this kind of affirming this trust in your capacity to overcome a risk. Capacity has to matter, and in some kind of pure uncontrollable risk settings it doesn't. And then the other thing which I think highlights that in the kind of cultivated risk-seeking literature, and in this impression that we have of, I love the thrill I get when I go and I climb this mountain, that's in juxtaposition to the routine, mundane, low-risk experience of my everyday life. It's like you say, it's something that you jump into, but equally it's something that you can jump out of. And so it's not a kind of existential and pervasive experience of every day of your life you worry about whether you will keep your job, or in the current context I think we have this much more pervasive health risk that's really kind of affecting the daily life, but doesn't have this element that it's in contrast to routine. It is the routine, and it is pervasive in that way. And this was our attempt, drawing on a kind of big literature in this kind of cultivated risk-seeking work in sociology mainly, to try to pin down why we would have this intuition that some risks do feel good, but that economic risk is really not one of those.
So let's finally think policy implications. So I guess one implication is, well, we shouldn't ban mountain climbing. A more important implication is strong, generous social safety nets are probably a good thing.
Yes, from the perspective of insuring against risk, that definitely makes sense, or at least the argument that joy of risk undermines this institutional framework, that doesn't go through for us. And so, and actually, interestingly, kind of with reference to that, our last little piece of conversation, there is some evidence that people who have less risky everyday, if you will, are more likely to actually go and take whether it's entrepreneurial risks, and that's a finding about kind of the safety net of the welfare state may actually allow people to take more risks in terms of entrepreneurship. And there's also some evidence that people who live in very, very low risk and kind of collective communities take more financial risks. There's some interesting work on this. It's called the cushion effect, that when you have a very stable cushion, that leads to kind of risk-seeking or greater acceptance of risk in these more narrowly defined areas.
Yeah, and that leads me on to one just final potential implication that it certainly intrigues me, that if we're thinking about the policymaking process and we're thinking about policymakers, then quite a lot of those policymakers are pretty well-off people. So I guess they've got quite a strong cushion, if you like. And they may therefore be used to the idea that risk is something rather good, that risk is something that they choose to take on and they value, and they think risk does stimulate you to do better work. And I just wonder, does that lead them to have a more positive view of risk and a greater inclination to think that it's fine to kind of impose risk on the wider population than would be the case if they were kind of truly representative of the population as a whole in terms of the degree to which they're exposed to the more pervasive dragging you down, grinding you down kinds of risk that many people face. So potentially we have a kind of skew in our policymaking system towards loading more risk onto people than is actually reasonable?
I don't know anything about differences across people in terms of their willingness to impose risk on others. That's, I think, quite a complicated question. But we do know, in general, a reasonable amount about people's risk perceptions and risk acceptance. And on those dimensions, I think you're more or less right. Certainly, one of the most robust findings in this literature is term was coined 20 years ago now, is the white male effect of all kind of demographic groups. This is American data, but I would not be surprised that it looks similar in Britain. Non-white women, white women, and non-white men all look relatively similar in terms of their perceptions of the riskiness of various types of behavior. And white men just don't think things are that risky. And so, when we do think about the demographic representation among policymakers, I think we see that an overrepresentation of that group that under assesses risk. So we don't know much about income, class, background of people and their risk-seeking, risk-lovingness, mainly because I think, as I said, this work is more so in psychology and in public health, and it's, I think, a ripe area for exploration by political scientists to think about those kind of political differences in attitudes towards risk. But there is some work from psychology which I think is really relevant here, which is that experience high levels of power also are more likely to engage in risky behaviors. And I think the chain goes power, confidence, risk-taking. So it's a little bit of a long chain. But in that regard, I think your intuitions are right on. To the extent that we know things, I think they accord with your intuitions there.
Interesting. Really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Lucy, for introducing us to that work. Thought-provoking study in itself, and so much more, so many further questions that it raises. I hope you'll be continuing in this vein for some time to come. So thank you, Lucy. Next time, we're looking at the role of monarchy in modern democracy. Serious books on monarchy are rare, but a new volume on Europe's 8 contemporary monarchies helps to fill the gap. So, does monarchy still deserve the attention of students of politics? And is the fact that most of the world's healthiest democracies are monarchies anything more than a coincidence? We'll be asking one of the new book's co-authors, Professor Robert Hazel. I'm Alan Renwick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.